What happens when a movie crashes so hard that the audience simply gets up and walks away? But time, against all logic, refuses to erase it from memory. The 1970s and 80s were overflowing with daring ideas, risky storytelling, and films that completely missed our moment. Some were mocked, some were ignored, and some vanished overnight, leaving nothing behind but the confusion of studio executives. But here is the twist. Decades later, these very failures found loyal fans, midnight screenings, and the status of cultural shrines. These aren't just box office flops, they're delayed explosions, and each of them still feels uncomfortably modern today. Number 10. Sorcerer, 1977. Released in the same legendary summer as the original Star Wars, Sorcerer stood absolutely no chance against a rising tide of blockbuster escapism. Director William Friedkin, who was at the peak of his power following the massive success of The Exorcist, delivered something so relentlessly grim and physically exhausting that audiences simply recoiled in shock. It was a film that felt like a slow descent into purgatory, following four desperate men driving truckloads of unstable nitroglycerin through the rotting, rain-soaked jungles of South America. The production itself was a notorious nightmare of practical effects and genuine physical danger, and that suffocating tension bled into every single frame, making the viewing experience almost unbearable. The audience expected a high-octane thrill ride, but what they received instead was a grueling, agonizing study of human greed and cosmic indifference. The sound of grinding gears and the sight of fragile wooden bridges swaying over a violent abyss created an atmosphere of pure dread that left viewers feeling drained and hollow rather than entertained. Critics of the time dismissed it as an overblown exercise in nihilism, and the film sank at the box office, nearly dragging the studio down with it. However, as the decades passed, Sorcerer was rediscovered as a technical masterpiece of suspense and the absolute peak of 1970s auteur ambition. It didn't fail because of a lack of skill. It failed because it forced people to look directly into the abyss at the exact moment they wanted to be looking at the stars. Number 9. Blade Runner, 1982. It is difficult to believe today, but Blade Runner was considered a colossal disappointment when it first hit theaters in June of 1982. Audiences, primed for the adventurous spirit of Indiana Jones or the heart-wrenching warmth of E.T., found Ridley Scott's vision of the future to be cold, depressing, and inexplicably slow. It was a detective story that wasn't actually interested in the crime itself, but rather in the flickering, dying soul of the machine. The film was drenched in a neon-soaked, rain-heavy melancholy, where the city felt like a decaying living organism. The pacing was deliberately hypnotic, prioritizing mood, texture, and philosophical questions about mortality over the action-packed sequences that the marketing had promised. The original theatrical cut, burdened with a clunky, unnecessary voiceover and the forced happy ending, only added to the sense that the movie didn't quite know what it wanted to be. Critics were harsh, famously calling it science fiction for the bored. But Scott's visual language was far too powerful to stay buried under bad reviews. Through the emergence of various director's cuts and endless late-night cable rotations, the film transformed from a box office outcast into the definitive blueprint for the entire cyberpunk genre. It failed because it was a deep meditation disguised as an action movie, a quiet, haunting reflection that required the world to slow down significantly before it could truly be understood. Number 8. The Thing, 1982. The Thing is perhaps one of the most tragic box office casualties of the 1980s. Released during a summer when the world was falling in love with the friendly, wide-eyed aliens of Steven Spielberg, John Carpenter offered a vision of extraterrestrial life that was repulsive, paranoid, and utterly merciless. The film trapped a group of men in a remote Antarctic research station with a shape-shifting creature, turning the setting into a pressure cooker of mistrust where any character could be the enemy at any second. The groundbreaking practical effects were so visceral, grotesque, and hyper-realistic that they physically repelled both viewers and critics, who dismissed the film as barbaric junk. There was no room for hope in this story, no clear hero to save the day, and a final scene that offered only a cold, ambiguous silence in the middle of a burning wasteland. This refusal to provide any form of comfortable resolution led to a disastrous theatrical run, nearly derailing Carpenter's career. Yet, as the years rolled by, the incredible craftsmanship of the special effects and the suffocating sense of existential dread began to resonate with a new generation. What was once labeled as excessive is now recognized as the absolute pinnacle of practical makeup artistry, and its themes of isolation and the breakdown of social trust feel more relevant now than ever before. The Thing didn't fail because it was poorly made. It failed because it was far too honest about the darkness of the unknown at a time when audiences were looking for a friend from the stars. Number 7. Possession, 1981. This film by Andrzej Zulawski was met not just with a cold reception, but with genuine shock and an immediate ban in several countries, including the UK, where it was branded a video nasty. Audiences expecting a standard horror movie or a typical drama about a crumbling marriage found themselves trapped in a hysterical, bloody, and deeply metaphorical nightmare that defied all conventional logic. It was a story of a domestic breakup transformed into a physical, monstrous mutation, where emotions weren't spoken. They were screamed, bled, and torn out of the body through the flesh. The tone of the film was so feverish, and the acting, particularly by Isabelle Adani, was so extreme and unhinged that the public felt physically attacked by the screen. In its initial release, it looked like a chaotic, unintelligible mess that was impossible to watch without flinching. Studios, terrified by the reaction, cut the film down by nearly half for the US market, turning it into an incoherent slasher movie, which effectively killed any remaining interest from the audience. However, decades later, Possession rose from the ashes as one of the most powerful examples of transgressive art ever filmed. Today, critics see it as a brilliant, agonizing allegory for human grief and the total loss of self-control. The film failed because it refused to be polite. It didn't want to entertain you. It wanted to turn you inside out, and it took 40 years for the world to find people brave enough to endure it. Number 6. Videodrome, 1983. When David Cronenberg's Videodrome arrived in theaters, it was a spectacular failure that left both audiences and critics profoundly disturbed and deeply confused. In an era dominated by neon lights and upbeat pop culture, Cronenberg presented a cold, clinical, and grotesque vision of a world where television signals could physically alter human DNA. The story of a sleazy cable programmer who discovers a broadcast that causes hallucinations and bodily mutations was far too weird for the mainstream market of 1983. Viewers were repulsed by the film's body horror and its cynical take on media consumption, finding the blending of technology and flesh to be stomach-churning rather than thought-provoking. The narrative structure itself felt fragmented and hallucinatory, making it difficult for the average moviegoer to follow a clear path to a satisfying conclusion. At the box office, it was a ghost, disappearing almost as quickly as a static-filled TV signal. Yet, as the digital age truly arrived, Videodrome began to look less like a fantasy and more like a prophecy. Its themes of social isolation, the blurring of reality through screens, and the addictive nature of extreme content became the reality of the 21st century. What was once dismissed as unwatchable filth is now studied as a visionary masterpiece of sociological horror. It failed because it saw the future too clearly, and that future was a place the 1980s weren't ready to visit. Number 5. The King of Comedy, 1982. Coming off the massive success of Raging Bull, Martin Scorsese delivered The King of Comedy, and the world simply didn't know how to react. Audiences saw Robert De Niro on the poster and expected another powerful, perhaps violent drama, or maybe, given the title, a lighthearted romp. Instead, they were met with an excruciatingly awkward and bone-dry satire about obsession and the hollow nature of celebrity. It was a movie that didn't just invite discomfort, it lived in it. The character of Rupert Pupkin was not a hero, nor was he a typical villain. He was a pathetic, delusional man whose desperate need for fame was so relatable, it made the audience want to crawl out of their skin. There were no big emotional outbursts and no traditional movie magic, just long, static shots of a man talking to cardboard cutouts in his basement. In 1982, this was professional suicide. The film was a massive commercial flop, earning back only a fraction of its budget. Critics called it uncomfortably dull and creepy. But as the culture of famous for being famous took over the world, the film's status shifted dramatically. Today, it is regarded as one of Scorsese's finest and most prophetic works, a chilling look at the dark side of the American dream. It failed because it was a mirror held up to the audience's own desperate desires, and in 1982, nobody wanted to see that reflection. Number 4. Blue Velvet, 1986. When David Lynch unleashed Blue Velvet upon the mid-80s, it felt less like a movie premiere and more like a collective social wound being opened. Audiences who were accustomed to the bright, neon-filtered optimism of the era walked into the theater and were met with a vision that was rotting from the inside out. The film starts with a picket fence American dream and quickly descends into a voyeuristic nightmare involving sexual deviance, sudden violence, and a level of psychological darkness that left mainstream viewers feeling physically ill and deeply violated. The initial response was one of pure, unadulterated hostility. People didn't just dislike the film, they felt it shouldn't exist. It was called sick, perverted, and meaningless filth. At the box office, it struggled to find a footing because it occupied a space between high art and exploitation that didn't have a name yet. But as the years passed, the world began to realize that Lynch wasn't just trying to shock, he was stripping away the wallpaper of suburban life to show the insects crawling underneath. The film's strange, dreamlike logic and its haunting, slow-burning pace eventually became the hallmark of a new kind of cinematic language. What was once seen as a grotesque failure is now studied as a definitive masterpiece of the American surreal. It failed because it showed the audience a version of themselves they weren't ready to acknowledge, and it took a generation for the world to admit that the darkness Lynch saw was real. 3. Brazil, 1985. Terry Gilliam's Brazil is a movie that almost didn't see the light of day because the studio was so convinced it was a disaster. It was a film that refused to fit into any marketable box, a bureaucratic nightmare wrapped in a steampunk fantasy, dripping with black humor and a suffocating sense of despair. When it finally reached theaters after a legendary legal battle, audiences were overwhelmed by its visual clutter, its frantic energy, and its uncompromisingly bleak ending. The movie felt like a fever dream that wouldn't end, and for a public used to the clean, heroic arcs of 80s blockbusters, Brazil was an exhausting and confusing ordeal. The ticket sales reflected this disconnect. The film was a massive commercial disappointment, perceived as a self-indulgent mess that was too weird for the masses. But the very thing that made it fail, its refusal to be simple, is what gave it a second life. As society became more entangled in technology and bureaucracy, the film's absurd vision began to feel like a documentary. Its intricate handmade sets and its prophetic warnings about a lost individual in a faceless system turned it into a cult icon for every visionary filmmaker who followed. It failed because it was too dense for a single viewing, requiring decades of rewatching to fully uncover the genius buried under its chaotic surface. Number 2. Scarface, 1983. It is often forgotten that Brian De Palma's Scarface was savaged by critics and largely rejected by the film establishment when it first debuted. It was seen as an orgy of unnecessary violence, over-the-top acting, and a vulgarity that many felt was beneath the dignity of serious cinema. To the 1983 audience, Al Pacino's performance felt like a caricature rather than a character, and the movie's 3-hour runtime was described as an endurance test of noise and blood. The establishment viewed it as a hollow, flashy disaster, a movie that had lost its way in a cloud of cocaine and neon lights. It didn't win the awards or the massive opening weekend respect the studio had hoped for, and for a long time it was written off as a failed experiment in excess. However, Scarface didn't need the critics. It found its heartbeat in the streets. As the years went by, the film's themes of ambition, betrayal, and the hollow core of the American dream resonated with a global subculture that saw the character of Tony Montana as a tragic icon rather than a villain. What was once dismissed as overacting and cheap spectacle became the visual and cultural language of an entire generation. It failed because it was too loud for the polite society of the early 80s, and it had to wait for the world to get a little louder before it could finally be heard. 1. The Shining, 1980. Perhaps the most shocking entry on this list is The Shining. It is now considered one of the greatest horror films ever made, but upon its release, it was a massive critical and commercial disappointment. Stanley Kubrick was actually nominated for a Razzie Award for Worst Director, and Stephen King famously hated the adaptation. Audiences were confused by the film's coldness. They expected jump scares and a traditional haunted house story, but instead they got a slow, psychological disintegration that felt clinical and strangely empty. The film's pacing was described as glacial, and its refusal to explain its supernatural elements left people feeling frustrated rather than frightened. It was a movie that seemed to move with its own internal clock, ignoring the pulse of the audience entirely. For years, it was seen as one of Kubrick's few missteps, a beautiful but hollow failure. But the silence of the film was its greatest weapon. As viewers revisited the Overlook Hotel over and over again on home video, they began to notice the impossible geometry, the hidden symbols, and the sheer, terrifying precision of Kubrick's vision. The movie didn't just haunt a house, it haunted the minds of everyone who watched it. It failed because it was a delayed explosion in its purest form, a film that needed to sit in the dark for years before its true power could be felt. Today, it stands as a monument to the idea that a movie's first impression is often its least important one. Maybe failure isn't the end of the story. Maybe it's just the wrong audience, the wrong moment, or the wrong decade. These movies didn't disappear into the void. They waited in the shadows, on old tapes and in late-night conversations until the world was finally ready to understand them. And when the world finally caught up, they found a kind of immortality that ticket sales could never buy. Now, it's your turn. Which of these fallen legends surprised you the most? Which one do you think deserves a third or even a fourth look? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep the conversation alive, because sometimes the movies that lose first are the ones that last forever.